What if the food on your plate tomorrow depended on a narrow strip of ocean, a strip you do not own, cannot control, and cannot protect? What if 6 words posted on a social media platform by one man sitting thousands of miles away had the power to threaten the food supply of 1.5 billion people? That is exactly what happened on the 12th of April, 2026. And the world watched. Some cheered, some panicked. But India did what those of us watching from the outside have seen it do time and time again. It stood firm. It assessed the threat. And it began quietly, urgently, with that unmistakable resolve that this nation carries in its bones to fight back. There is something in this country that does not surrender. Something that looks at a wall and starts looking for a door. Something that looks at a problem and starts building a solution before the rest of the world has even finished reading the headline. This is a country that has survived famines that killed millions. It has survived partition. It has survived wars on multiple fronts. And every single time, it has found a way to protect its people. Not without pain, not without sacrifice, but with a will that the outside world consistently underestimates. What is being witnessed right now is that same will being tested again, in a quieter way than a war, in a slower way than a famine, but in a way that is arguably just as dangerous because this crisis hides in soil chemistry, in shipping lanes and fertilizer subsidies, rather than in headlines and battlefields. This is a story about food, about soil, about the invisible threads that hold a civilization of 1.5 billion people together, and about a nation that absolutely refuses to let those threads be cut by forces beyond its borders. This is India's story, and those of us watching from the outside can only hope the world is paying attention. On a morning in April 2026, the President of the United States logged on to Truth Social and posted a message. The United States will be blocking ships from the Strait of Hormuz. Within hours, headlines were burning across every major news channel. Oil prices were spiking, shipping companies were scrambling, and governments across the continent were holding emergency meetings behind closed doors. The blockade of the Strait of Hormuz was no longer a theoretical threat discussed in think tanks. It was real, and it was happening. Now, most people watching that news from the outside would have thought about oil. They would have thought about petrol prices going up, about supply chains getting disrupted, about airlines and factories and cars. That is the obvious story. That is the story most channels covered. But there is another story. The story of what a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz would do to India's food supply. And once you understand this story, once you see the numbers and the maps and the data, you will never look at a bag of fertilizer the same way again. India's food system depends on 6 major supply routes bringing in key agricultural nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK. Without them, crops cannot grow. The problem? India produces very little of these on its own and relies heavily on imports. Most of these supply lines pass through a single choke point, the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow stretch of ocean just 33 kilometers wide. That means the food supply for 1.4 billion people depends on a vulnerable corridor now under threat. To understand why that is so dangerous, you have to understand how modern agriculture actually works. Modern agriculture was transformed by the Haber-Bosch process, which made fertilizer from air and helped feed billions, but created dependence on natural gas. India relies heavily on imports for all 3 key nutrients: nitrogen, via gas, phosphorus, from a few countries like Morocco, and potash, which India lacks entirely. Most of these supplies move through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow, vulnerable choke point. The Green Revolution boosted India's food output 5-fold, but fertilizer use rose 280 times, locking the country into imports and heavy subsidies. Overuse is now degrading soil, polluting water, and trapping farmers in a cycle of rising dependency. At this point, the obvious question arises: why not switch to organic farming? Switching to organic farming isn't a near-term solution. Yields would drop 20 to 25%. Risking food shortages for hundreds of millions. Transitioning would take decades. India avoided famine, but built a fragile system, one that depends on global supply chains, constant fertilizer flow, and a single narrow sea route staying open. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. It sits between the Arabian Peninsula and the coast of Iran. It connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and from there to the Indian Ocean and the world's shipping lanes. Every single day, approximately 20 million barrels of oil pass through that strait. That is roughly 20% of the world's entire oil consumption. And more than 80% of the oil that passes through the Strait of Hormuz is headed to Asia, to India, to China, to Japan, to South Korea, to the energy-hungry economies of the world's most populous continent. But again, this is not just an oil story. Liquefied natural gas, ammonia, fertilizer raw materials, the building blocks of the food supply, all of it travels through or depends on routes connected to the Strait of Hormuz. When the United States announced it would be blocking ships from passing through the strait, the Indian market sent immediate signals of alarm. There were already glimpses of what this kind of disruption could do. The LPG crisis that India had experienced gave a preview. But LPG is a cooking gas. It is painful when it runs short. Fertilizer is different. Fertilizer shortage is not painful in the same immediate way. You do not feel it in your kitchen on the first day or the first week. You feel it at the end of a growing season, when the yields come in below what was expected, when the grain stores are not full enough, when the prices start climbing in the markets, when the government starts making difficult choices about how to allocate what remains. That is how a fertilizer crisis becomes a food crisis. Slowly, quietly, and then, suddenly, all at once. India understood this, and for observers watching from outside, who care about this nation and its people, the announcement of the Hormuz blockade was not just a geopolitical moment, it was a moment of genuine fear for what might come next. This is the part of the story that the outside world needs to hear, because India is not standing still. India is not simply accepting this vulnerability and waiting for disaster. India is fighting back. And some of what India's scientists and government are developing right now is genuinely, breathtakingly innovative. The first solution is something called Nano Urea. To understand why Nano Urea matters, you need to understand how traditional urea works and how wasteful that process actually is. When a farmer spreads urea granules on a field, those granules need to dissolve into the soil. They need rain to carry them down to the root zone. They need to interact with soil chemistry in complex ways. And in this entire process, roughly 70% of the urea applied never actually reaches the plant. It evaporates, washes away, gets locked in chemical forms the plant cannot use. 70% of every bag of expensive, imported, heavily subsidized urea is simply lost. Nano Urea changes this completely. The concept is straightforward. Instead of large granules that you scatter on the ground, Nano Urea consists of urea broken down into particles between 30 and 50 nanometers in size. At that scale, the particles can be sprayed directly onto the leaves of plants using drones. They enter the plant through tiny pores called stomata and are delivered straight into the plant's vascular system directly to where they are needed. The efficiency improvement is dramatic. Where traditional urea delivers nitrogen to plants at a rate of 30 to 40%, Nano Urea achieves efficiency of 80 to 90%, more than twice as effective, and at a fraction of the volume. Here is what that means in the economic terms. A 45-kilogram bag of urea costs the government 2,200 rupees. To replace that bag's effect with Nano Urea in drone delivery costs approximately 500 rupees. The farmer's out-of-pocket cost might increase slightly from 242 rupees to 500 rupees, but the government's cost effectively disappears. Instead of subsidizing a 2,200 rupee bag, the government could subsidize a 500 rupee bottle and save over 1,700 rupees per application. India's scientists did not just theorize about this. The Indian Farmers Fertilizer Cooperative IFFCO actually developed and launched the world's first nano urea commercially. Indian engineers, Indian scientists, Indian innovation. The states of Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, and Andhra Pradesh are already deploying nano urea through drone spraying programs. This is not a pilot project discussed in academic papers. This is happening on Indian farms right now. And for those who are building businesses in the drone sector, in agricultural technology, in precision delivery systems, the Indian government is actively, urgently looking for partners. Because every rupee saved on fertilizer subsidies is a rupee that can go to schools, to hospitals, to infrastructure, to the investments that will shape India's future. But honesty requires acknowledging what nano-urea does not solve. Nano-urea addresses nitrogen, one nutrient of three. India still imports virtually all of its phosphorus from Morocco, and Morocco is not a close neighbor. It is not a natural ally. It controls 70% of the world's known phosphate reserves and has enormous leverage over any country that depends on those reserves, which includes India. India still imports almost all of its potash from Canada, Russia, and Belarus, countries that are either geographically distant or currently enmeshed in geopolitical tensions that make long-term supply agreements uncertain. The doom loop of cheap, subsidized urea, leading to over-application, leading to soil destruction, leading to even more urea dependence, that loop is still spinning. The nano-urea solution can help break it over time, but it will not happen quickly. It will require changing farming practices that have been established over decades. It will require persuading millions of individual farmers to trust a new technology. It will require continued investment, continued innovation, and continued political will. And through all of this, the Strait of Hormuz continues to be the choke point. Those 6 arrows on the map, the 6 supply lines for fertilizer that feed India, they are all still there. They are still vulnerable. They are still dependencies that India has not been able to fully replace. Every crisis contains within it the seed of an opportunity, and the fertilizer crisis that India faces today is no different. Consider what India has accomplished in a few short decades in other sectors where it identified strategic vulnerability. India built a space program. India developed nuclear energy. India created one of the world's largest software industries from almost nothing. When India decides that something is strategically important, when it decides at a national level that a dependency needs to be reduced, it has shown a remarkable capacity to act. Agricultural technology is the next frontier, and the scale of the opportunity is enormous. The Indian government is spending 6.77 lakh crore rupees on fertilizer subsidies since the Russia-Ukraine war alone. That is money that is currently flowing to foreign producers, foreign shippers, and foreign governments. Even a fraction of that money redirected toward domestic innovation, toward nano-fertilizers, toward soil health technology, toward alternative nutrient delivery systems could transform the picture. There is already work happening in precision agriculture that uses sensor technology to tell farmers exactly how much of each nutrient their soil needs, rather than applying blanket doses and hoping for the best. Precision application could dramatically reduce the total volume of fertilizer needed, which would reduce the import bill, which would reduce the subsidy burden, which would allow the government to redirect resources to other priorities. There is research happening into biological nitrogen fixation engineering crops, or soil bacteria, that can extract nitrogen from the atmosphere the way that legumes naturally do, reducing dependence on synthetic nitrogen altogether. This is not science fiction. It is active research at agricultural universities and laboratories around the world, including in India. There is work being done on soil restoration, on rebuilding the organic matter and microbial ecosystems that decades of chemical farming have depleted, so that Indian soil gradually becomes less dependent on chemical inputs to be productive. And there is work to be done on diplomatic diversification, on building supply relationships with a wider range of countries for phosphate and potash, so that India is never dependent on a single source or a single shipping route for any critical input. None of this happens quickly. None of this is easy. But India has faced harder challenges before and overcome them. For those watching from outside India's borders, this story matters for a reason that goes beyond concern for one particular nation. India is home to approximately 1.4 billion human beings. That is roughly 17% of every person alive on Earth today. What happens to India's food supply matters to the entire planet in terms of global grain markets, in terms of migration pressures, in terms of the stability of one of the world's largest democracies. A food crisis in India, even a partial one, Even one that manifests primarily as higher prices rather than outright shortage would send ripples through the global economy that would be felt from London to Lagos to Los Angeles. And yet, the Strait of Hormuz, this 33-kilometer bottleneck on which so much of India's agricultural security depends, is controlled by none of India's decisions. It is subject to the geopolitics of the Middle East, to the calculations of Washington and Tehran, to decisions made in government offices on the other side of the world by people who may or may not be thinking about the farmers of Punjab when they make their strategic choices. That dependency is not India's fault. It is the accumulated consequence of decades of global economic integration, of the Green Revolution's success building upon imported inputs, of the geological luck or unluck that place phosphate reserves in Morocco and potash deposits in Canada, in Belarus, rather than on Indian soil. But it is India's challenge, and it is a challenge that India will have to solve because no one else will solve it for them. The countries that control the phosphate and the potash are not going to give India a better deal out of generosity. The gas exporting nations of the Middle East are not going to guarantee supply regardless of geopolitical conditions. The Strait of Hormuz will continue to be the choke point that it has always been. India's path forward runs through its own innovation, through nano urea and precision agriculture, and biological nitrogen fixation, and diplomatic diversification, and soil restoration. Through the brilliance of its scientists and the resilience of its farmers, and the long-term thinking of its policymakers. Right now in 2026, India stands at a crossroads that has been decades in the making. On one side is the path that India has been on: cheap subsidized fertilizers, imported raw materials, soil that is getting weaker, groundwater that is getting more contaminated, a subsidy bill that is growing, and a dependency on foreign nations and foreign shipping lanes that makes the country vulnerable to precisely the kind of shock that the Hormuz blockade represents. On the other side is a path that is harder, more expensive in the short term, and more uncertain. A path of technological innovation, of changing farming practices, of rebuilding soil health over years and decades, of building new supply chains and new diplomatic relationships and new domestic industries. India has begun walking toward that second path. The Nano Urea program is real. The drone deployment is real. The government's interest in solving this problem is real. But the journey is long, and the urgency created by a tweet on Truth Social on April 12th, 2026 could not be more viscerally clear. Every season that passes without change is another season of soil damage, another season of groundwater contamination, another season of subsidy spending that builds dependence rather than independence, another season of vulnerability to a blockade, a war, a price spike, a political decision made in a foreign capital. And yet, and this is what must be said clearly, by anyone who watches India with open eyes and honest intention, India has faced worse. India survived 24 famines in 50 years of brutal colonial rule. India survived partition. India survived wars. India built one of the world's largest economies from almost nothing in a matter of decades. India sent a spacecraft to the moon. India built a software industry that serves the entire world. India is home to some of the most brilliant scientists, engineers, and agricultural researchers working anywhere on the planet today. The fertilizer problem is real. The soil crisis is real. The Hormuz vulnerability is real. But so is India's capacity to solve problems that would break other nations. From the outside, watching this story unfold, one feeling comes through above all others: not pity. India does not need pity, and it certainly does not need condescension from those who observe from a distance of comfort and abstraction. Not fear, although fear is not an irrational response to what the data reveals. The feeling is something deeper, something more complex. It is awe, combined with a fierce, almost stubborn hope. Awe at what India has built, at the farms that feed 1.4 billion people, at a green revolution that, within a single generation, pushed back the specter of famine that had haunted this land for centuries. At scientists who are now pioneering nano-urea, reimagining how nutrients reach crops. At farmers who have endured cycles of drought, flood, policy change, and economic pressure, and still rise each season to plan again. And hope real, evidence-based hope that India will find its way through this crisis, just as it has through so many before. But this is not just India's story, because when 17% of humanity depends on a system that runs through a 33-kilometer-wide choke point, a choke point shaped not by Indian policy, but by the geopolitics of the Middle East, by decisions made in Washington, Tehran, Riyadh, and beyond, this becomes a global story. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway, it is a pressure valve in the international system. Every escalation in the Gulf, every sanction, every naval maneuver, every political decision made thousands of miles away, they ripple outward, into energy markets, into fertilizer supply chains, into food prices, into the lives of farmers in Punjab and consumers in cities across India. And if that system fractures even briefly, the consequences do not stop at India's borders. They move through global grain markets. They affect inflation worldwide. They shape migration patterns. They test political stability. They redefine alliances. In a deeply interconnected world, a fertilizer shortage in India is not a local problem. It is a global shock waiting to happen. And that is why the questions that remain are so important. Will India be able to build a fertilizer supply chain that no longer depends on a single maritime choke point? Will the soil of Punjab and Haryana be restored before decades of overuse push it beyond recovery? Will groundwater systems be protected before contamination becomes irreversible? Will innovations like Nano Urea scale fast enough to matter not in pilot programs, but across millions of farms? Will India diversify its supply chains, its diplomacy, its domestic capabilities fast enough to stay ahead of the next crisis? No one can answer these questions with certainty. The future is uncertain. The challenges are enormous. But history offers a pattern. When India decides that something is non-negotiable, when it decides that a vulnerability must be eliminated, it has shown time and again an extraordinary ability to mobilize talent, resources, and willpower at a scale few nations can match. The soil is not dead yet. The water is not beyond saving. The innovation is already underway. And the question that should be echoing in India and around the world is this: how much time does India have before the doom loop completes its final turn? Because if there is an honest answer to that question, and there is, then the clock is not starting. It is already running. And the farmers of Punjab are already waiting. If you found this story valuable, if it changed the way you think about food, about geopolitics, about the invisible systems that keep billions of people alive, then don't stop here. Subscribe. Because this is just one thread in a much larger story, a story about how the modern world actually works beneath the surface, about supply chains you never see, dependencies no one talks about, decisions made in one part of the world that quietly shape the lives of millions somewhere else. There are more stories like this. Stories about water, about energy, about technology, about the systems holding up entire civilizations and what happens when they begin to strain. If you want to understand the world not just as it appears, but as it truly functions, this is where those conversations happen. So subscribe, stay curious, and keep watching, because the next story might explain something even closer to your own life than you expect.